French President Emmanuel Macron says he plans to discuss sharing France's nuclear deterrents with its European allies. He made the announcement during a national televised address to the nation in which he expressed uncertainty over the transatlantic partnership with the US as Washington moves closer to Moscow.
I want to believe the US will remain at our side, but we also have to be ready if this is not the case. Whether peace in Ukraine is achieved quickly or not, European states must, in the face of the Russian threat that I've just described, be capable of defending themselves better and of deterring any future aggression. Whatever happens, we have to equip ourselves further.
And let's bring in our correspondent Lisa Louis in Paris. So what's the French president's plan?
Well, President Emmanuel Macron was tonight appealing to the French people to change their mindset. You know, he said Russia is a clear threat not only for Ukraine but also for Europe and France, and that the French needed to respond to that accordingly. He was talking about increasing defense capacity here in France, you know, that there needed to be made sacrifices, that money would have to be spent on that. He was also talking about France's nuclear deterrence. You know that France is one of the only countries in the European Union to have nuclear weapons, and that the country uses as a deterrent. And Macron has been talking also over the past few days about maybe extending that deterrent capacity to other countries across the European Union. All this comes ahead of a meeting tomorrow in Brussels, where the 27 heads of state of the European Union will come together and are planning to, determine and to agree on a common statement, on a common plan, for maybe common spending, and also to provide more ammunition, more weapons to Ukraine, to stand with Ukraine in front of the Russian aggression.
And in the lead up to that meeting, here's an interesting one. Emmanuel Macron has been meeting with Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban. I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall.
Absolutely. Viktor Orban is known to be one of the leaders in Europe that has a pro-Russian stance, just as the leader of Slovakia, for example. And so Emmanuel Macron was meeting him tonight to try to convince him to actually agree on that draft agreement that is already circulating amongst European member states. So one point where the Hungarian leader seems to be disagreeing when it comes to that statement is, sending the fact that the EU aims to send additional ammunition to Ukraine. So Emmanuel Macron invited Viktor Orban tonight, hoping that he might convince him, that he might negotiate with him, be able to negotiate with him so that he will sign that common statement tomorrow. Mind you, Emmanuel Macron has been advocating for a so-called Europe de la Défense, defense alliance that the European Union should turn into, and he's now pushing forward for Europe to build up its own production capacities when it comes to the defense sector. But he also knows that the EU is playing for time, as for the coming years they will still need the support of the US, and that's, as we just heard, also part of his strategy. He wants to, convince European leaders to go towards that common defense capacity, but also try to keep the US on board. It is a fine line, really.
It sure is. Thanks for joining us. DW's Lisa Louis in the French capital. Well, that summit of EU leaders gets underway Thursday. They'll be debating how best to bolster Europe's defences and increase help to Ukraine, whose President Volodymyr Zelensky will join them. Our Brussels correspondent Anshal Vora has more.
A visit to Notre Dame Cathedral, an invitation from King Charles. Flattery Europeans hoped would win over Donald Trump.
We gave you military equipment, and you met a...
But a heated exchange on live television between the American and the Ukrainian presidents over the weekend not only threatened the US's support to Ukraine, but also turned into a moment of reckoning for Europe. It's time to rearm Europe, said EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, as allies prepare to discuss a plan that could unlock around €800 billion in defence investments over the next 4 years.
We are in an era of rearmament. And Europe is ready to massively boost its defence spending, both to respond to the short-term urgency to act and to support Ukraine, but also to address the long-term need to take on more responsibility for our own European security.
The funding for this would come from a sharp increase in defence spending by member states.
Europeans will need to replace over the long term United States contributions to European security that include, for example, control and command equipment, intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance.
But that could take a decade or more. And Trump's condition for the US's continued security umbrella, increased defence expenditure to 5% of national GDPs, is deemed unrealistic by most European partners. EU leaders will face severe political opposition at home if they attempt to slash social welfare and divert that money towards defence.
The European Union is trying to take the initiative to bring the member states together and find a way to fund the rearmament. But it runs the risk of being seen as too involved, extending its reach by member states who believe defence is the responsibility of national governments. And then there is Viktor Orban, Hungary's Prime Minister, who many here in Brussels see as a Trojan horse, doing Russia's bidding inside the EU.
Orban has often tried to block aid for Ukraine, but often relented when the time came to exercise his veto. Now, as he tries to ingratiate himself with President Trump, it could be hard for European leadership to get him to go along. Orban has called on the EU to follow Trump's lead and discuss a ceasefire directly with Russia. Experts say the EU could still find a way to move forward, even in the face of Hungary's opposition, by forming a coalition of willing nations on certain decisions, such as sending aid to Ukraine, as well as on the proposal to send European troops to police a future peace deal between Ukraine and Russia.
There have been many instances also in the Euro crisis where Europeans have been able to go ahead in smaller groups rather than in an EU framework. So one way to look at it is to say that the EU is abandoning its consensus approach. Another way to look at it is to say that the EU has always been fairly flexible.
In the face of the US's new foreign policy, there is a sense of urgency in Europe to ramp up its defence. But if some member states refuse to participate, others outside the bloc can be brought in as partners. Norway and Canada were present at the conference hosted by non-EU NATO member the UK, while Hungary and Slovakia, which is also seen as being soft on Russia, were left out. For Europe, it's a paradigm shift, and it's going to be a massive undertaking. There are no illusions about that.